If you feel like fantasy football is a big struggle right now, I can promise you, you're not the only one. Injuries, underperforming players, inconsistencies, you name it, this season has had it. And it's made it one of the most difficult seasons that I can remember since probably the COVID year to try and predict. But that doesn't mean that you still shouldn't keep planning, and if you're alive in your league, keep the faith, and if we can get a couple of wins in a row, you're right back in this thing. And like I always say, get me in the playoffs, then anything can happen. And before we start jumping into all of the matchups for week 9 for running backs, we're going to take a look at the BRUNT Workhorse report and what running backs are getting the most work so far this season. And at the very top of the list, it's names that you expect to be there every single week still. Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley. Javonte Williams continues to be one of the better draft picks that anybody could make this season. Devon Achane is at the top, and even though Josh Jacobs lost quite a few touches last week, and it might be because he's banged up, we'll talk about it more, he still ranks 6th among running backs right now in total touches. Quinshon Judkins is still inside the top 10. He could end up missing some time, but luckily he's on a bye this week, so he'll get a week to heal up. RJ Harvey is coming off of a very big week, but that hasn't kept J.K. Dobbins from also still being number 12 in touches this year. David Canales said that he expects Rico Dowdle to get more touches now moving forward with how good he continues to be. He's already inside the top 24. Even with Chuba Hubbard back, will his number continue to rise? And how about a guy at the very end of the list, number 23, Kenneth Walker? I know him and Zach Charbonnet have been extremely frustrating this season, and that makes a whole lot of sense. But for him still to be inside the top 24, even with their bye, says a lot about the fact that he's still a guy that's getting more than enough workload. If he could just get some of these touchdowns that Zach Charbonnet keeps getting, you would feel a lot better about playing him. Even with some of the inconsistencies this year, some of these running backs continue to offer us a high performance every single week, just like our sponsors over at BRUNT, who offer high performance workwear for any job. All day comfort, heavy duty durability, and it's made for any trade. Plus, you can try it risk-free on the job site. Free shipping, free exchanges. Go check them out. If you're looking for some new workwear, BRUNT is exactly where you need to be. Use code HEADLINERS at checkout and you're going to get $10 off of your first order with BRUNT. Thursday night football, a majority of the time, seems like it's a snooze fest, but hopefully with Miami and Baltimore this week, we get a ton of points. Derrick Henry, hopefully, fingers crossed, is on the up and up, and we're starting to see a little bit more of his ceiling every single week, and he will be much better down the stretch than he was to begin the season. Right now, Miami is allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game, and Derrick Henry has run for 193 yards over the last 2 games. Now, he's only averaging 4.2 yards per carry, so the efficiency is not as good as what we have seen in the past. But maybe with Lamar Jackson on the way back, we can start to see some of that efficiency tick up, and we keep the volume going for him as well. Devon Achane gets an excellent matchup against Baltimore, allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And Devon Achane this season has scored at least 11 half PPR points in every single game. He has not finished any lower than RB16 to date in this season. Running backs going up against Baltimore have scored at least 1 rushing touchdown in every game but 2. So Devon Achane has a great upside not only for yards this week, but the ability to find the end zone as well. And we might get some questions about Ollie Gordon, but last week for me was more about game flow and the game script than it was Ollie Gordon actually being a significant contributor for fantasy moving forward. For Chicago and Cincinnati, we're also going to get a really solid matchup here to begin the week as well. Last week, I did not talk about Kyle Monangai in my running back video to begin the week, and a lot of people asked why, and it was like, I really don't see it. Like, I understand what he did last week, but I don't expect him to be a constant contributor moving forward. And he really didn't do anything last week. Obviously, if you tried to start him, it didn't work out. However, in this matchup, going up against Cincinnati, who currently allows the most fantasy points per game, and with the way Caleb Williams has played as of late, I wouldn't be shocked if A, DeAndre Swift has a ton of upside and finds himself inside the top 12 this week, but B, if Kyle Monangai actually becomes a guy that scores a touchdown for us and is a very, very risky flex option. DeAndre Swift has 1 touchdown in each of the last 4 games, 3 rushing and 1 receiving, and he's averaging almost 6.3 yards per carry over his last 3 games. For Cincinnati, since week 1, they've allowed at least 118 rushing yards in every single game. DeAndre Swift last week could have had a much bigger week, but unfortunately, due to game flow, I don't think that he reached it because of that. But he could be right back to that ceiling this week. Chase Brown is going to get an awesome opportunity to continue his resurgence against the Bears this week, who are currently allowing the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Now, since Joe Flacco joined the team, Chase Brown has 3 touchdowns. But the better news is he's averaging just under 11 carries per game, while averaging almost 75 rushing yards per game. That is a big jump from what he was doing earlier in the season. Now, he's not getting nearly as much work in the passing game as what we were originally seeing from him not only earlier in the year, but last season. So that's keeping his ceiling a little bit down. And Samaje Perine probably had too many touches for us to be comfortable with last week. He had 10 compared to Chase Brown's 15. We'll continue to monitor that workload moving forward, but for now, Chase Brown, I still think is a start in this matchup. For Minnesota and Detroit, this backfield for the Vikings is a little bit in flux right now because even before Aaron Jones ended up being injured, it felt like Jordan Mason was still going to have a substantial workload in this offense. That him and Aaron Jones were going to split carries. Aaron Jones was really going to make his mark in the passing game, but Jordan Mason was still going to have some sort of a role. And then Aaron Jones surprisingly comes back on Thursday Night Football last week, and Jordan Mason disappears. And they don't have a great matchup against Detroit this week. Detroit's defense currently allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. I read several reports before I recorded my running back video last week, and none of them seemed to think that Aaron Jones was going to play. And then last minute, not only is he activated, not only does he play, but he sees 53% of the snaps, compared to only 35% for Jordan Mason. And in this matchup against Detroit, I expect Jordan Mason to maybe see a few more snaps, but honestly, it's not a great matchup for him. It's going to go to Aaron Jones this week because he's going to have to do something in the passing game to help keep the ball moving, especially with J.J. McCarthy being back this week. I do anticipate both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery also making an impact this week. It can be tough passing against the Minnesota Vikings. Now, they have a quarterback in Jared Goff, who's one of the best in the league when it comes to facing the blitz. But Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery are both going to set the tone early in this game, especially at home. Kamani Vidal just ran for 117 yards against this Vikings defense. But even before that, there were a couple of running backs that still had success. Kenneth Gainwell, he ran for 99 yards. Judkins ran for over 100 yards. Saquon Barkley didn't fare nearly as well. He only ran for 44 yards, but we know he's been up and down to start the year. Carolina's going to have a tough matchup against Green Bay this week. But it's not just the tough matchup that worries me for Chuba Hubbard. It's what David Canales had to say in his press conferences after their game last week. Canales came out and just said it. Hey, we wanted to honor Chuba Hubbard as the starting running back. He lost that part of his job because he got injured. That's not his fault. So we wanted to give him an opportunity when he returned. But then he goes on to say, we can't ignore the fact that Rico Dowdle has been the better running back. That to me says Rico Dowdle is going to be getting at least 50% of the touches, and it would not shock me if he sees more if he continues to be the more efficient back. Green Bay allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, and last week Rico Dowdle averaged 6.8 yards per carry, compared to only 2.8 yards per carry for Chuba Hubbard on 12 carries. I feel like a lot of people are watching this segment of the video not for Josh Jacobs, but for Emmanuel Wilson, because you're probably wondering, can you start him after his performance last week? And I get the thought process there. I really do. But it's only the 2nd time all season that Emmanuel Wilson has had over 25 total yards in a game. Total yards. Not rushing, not receiving. total yards. He really has not been fantasy viable all season long. So if you're wanting to roll with Emmanuel Wilson, I personally have to wait another week. Was last week because Emmanuel Wilson is going to be that type of back moving forward? Or is it because of the way the game was working out? Is it because Josh Jacobs has been banged up and he just needed a little bit more rest last week? I'm not 1,000% sure on that. Josh Jacobs, we can lock him in for a touchdown every single week. He's still a start. But Emmanuel Wilson, I'm going to have to see a couple of consistent performances from him before I can put him as a starter on my team. Hold him on your bench? Sure. And if he goes off again this week and has another terrific week, we'll discuss it again next week. But I'm not ready to start him yet. I'm not. Kamani Vidal is going to get an opportunity to have another solid fantasy performance this week, going up against the Tennessee Titans, who have allowed the third most fantasy points per game. And probably almost half of those points have been given up to Jonathan Taylor over the course of 2 games. But Tennessee has allowed at least 1 rushing touchdown in every game this season. Jonathan Taylor accounts for 5 of the 12 rushing touchdowns Tennessee has allowed, which is the most any team has allowed in football. So not only do you have an opportunity to find the end zone on the ground against Tennessee, but the yards could be there as well. They're currently allowing the second most rushing yards in all of football. He didn't play well a couple of weeks ago against Indianapolis, but that performance was sandwiched in between a couple of big performances. He went for 124 yards against Miami and then 117 and a touchdown against Minnesota last week. This Tennessee Titans offense is rough to watch. The inconsistencies show up in every single game. You see some really good plays, and then you see like 3 straight drives where nothing works successfully for them. DK is really the only guy right now that you can look at as being fantasy viable on a consistent basis. And he only has 2 performances that really showcase that. Tajay Spears, for me, has to be the guy that you look at starting right now. I would love to see more work for Tony Pollard, but Tennessee just does not put themselves in a position to give him more work. You gotta be in a neutral or a positive game script, and Tennessee finds themselves playing from behind way too often. Now, Spears barely outsnapped Pollard 53% to 46% last week, but his numbers definitely were way better. And a part of the reason why is he's just on the field more because that's the way the game flow is going. I know as fantasy owners, analysts, all the above, it's super easy to be an armchair coach and look at a team and try to say, I don't think you're doing this right, or I think you're doing this terribly, or why aren't we doing this, or whatever it may be. But it's really easy to look at the Atlanta Falcons and ask yourself, how do you forget that you have Bijan Robinson so often? New England's currently allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game, and that team is playing very well, so it's not the best matchup in the world. But as long as Bijan gets the volume, we know he can find the yards. Tyler Algier has been a decent flex option at times, but again, just like Bijan, they completely abandon the run game, it feels like. Get Bijan going first. If you do that, everything else opens up, and hopefully Drake London is back this week because that will also help the run game. Atlanta defense looks really dominant at times, and then at other times, it's like they can't figure out what they're doing. And now they're allowing the 9th most fantasy points on the season to opposing running backs. Last week, TreVeyon Henderson had 75 rushing yards on 10 attempts against the Cleveland Browns, a team that has done well against the run all season. But once again, Ramondre Stevenson, 74% of the snaps. TreVeyon Henderson, only 21%. Both are risky. Neither of them present a whole lot of upside, but if you're dying for someone to be in your lineup that can give you a floor of like 5 to 6 fantasy points, I think both of these guys can make it work. San Francisco's matchup with the New York Giants this week is going to be a great opportunity for Christian McCaffrey to get back up on the horse. Last week was a big letdown, but this week, the Giants are allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Saquon Barkley just had a big day against them. Christian McCaffrey should be back up there towards the top 5 once again. After the unfortunate injury to Cam Scatabo last week, Tyrone Tracy finds himself as the starting running back once again. Hopefully Cam Scatabo heals up, he's healthy next season, and we see him back on the football field sooner rather than later. But for this year, Tyrone Tracy is going to be a guy that you can look to start at sometimes. He shows some explosiveness and he shows some big playability. I do think the big thing with Tyrone Tracy is just inconsistencies. Sometimes he's going to get stuck behind the line of scrimmage, and sometimes he's going to fumble the football. As long as he As long as he takes care of it, he shouldn't be that bad of an option. But if he keeps putting the ball on the ground, Devin Singletary could start seeing more touches. Indianapolis at Pittsburgh, and if you're here to wonder about Jonathan Taylor, then you're not playing fantasy football right. Just put the dude in your lineup and roll with it. 3 RB1 performances on the season. The dude is on an absolute tear. And Jaylen Warren is going to be a very risky fringe option for me this week. I don't know if I see a ton of upside in this matchup for him. Indianapolis is allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game. I would love to see him get a little bit more work in the passing game. That realistically has not worked out so far this season. And even though Kenneth Gainwell is still getting some touches, it's not enough to deter me from starting Jaylen Warren for those of you out there that need somebody with at least a decent floor. And I think that's what Jaylen Warren does in this matchup. He gives you a floor that's probably low-end RB2, high-end flex option, but I don't think his ceiling gives you really any more than that. I will say this, though. A couple of weeks ago against Cleveland, he ran for 52 yards on only 11 carries, which is a really solid number against that Cleveland defense. So if he can do that against Cleveland, he could do that against Indianapolis. A couple of strong defenses will be playing each other this week in the Denver and Houston matchup. And a lot of people are going to be asking about RJ Harvey. And I feel like seeing him as a sit on the screen is probably going to take some of you back because you're going to be wondering, he just had such a great week. Why wouldn't you play him? Let's talk about it. First off, Houston is allowing the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, so this isn't going to be the easiest matchup in the world. But let's just take a look at the numbers from his big performance last week. He had 1 touchdown run of 40 yards. He had 6 carries outside of that 1 touchdown run, and he only had 6 yards on those 6 carries. So yeah, he had a big run, but on the other 6 carries, he did absolutely nothing. Also, that touchdown reception, it was his only catch of the day. RJ Harvey played 17 snaps last week, and he scored 3 touchdowns. Over the previous 3 games before that, RJ Harvey had 16 yards on 10 carries. Do I believe they try to get RJ Harvey a little bit more involved? Absolutely. After a performance like that, it would make sense, but he's played well in a couple of other games this season, and it didn't really translate to a ton of extra snaps. Scoring 3 touchdowns on only 17 snaps, on 17 snaps scoring 1 touchdown is actually really good. And Dobbins continues to be a very safe option. He ran for over 100 yards again last week, and even though he did not score a touchdown, he continues to be a guy that gets the work in the red zone. And for J.K. Dobbins, he has at least 70 rushing yards in all but 2 games this season. It is a tougher matchup for him, but if he can give us 60 to 70 yards and a score, it's obviously worth it. Woody Marks to me is one of the riskier fringe options this week. If you're rolling with Woody Marks, you're probably playing with fire. The dude's going to have at least 40 receiving yards to make things work. And if he can find the end zone, then that's just a little bit of extra for us that we really weren't expecting. Not a great matchup. Denver's allowing the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And this matchup to me is just one that doesn't scream a whole lot of upside. And Marks has not established himself enough as the RB1 to get enough volume to kind of make up for that. Travis Etienne has slowed way down since the beginning of the season. After being a top 12 running back in 3 of their first 4 games, he has finished as the RB30, RB23, and RB32 since then. Being a top 12 running back again this week is going to be dependent on a positive game script. If Jacksonville can do that for Travis Etienne, then I think in this matchup, he absolutely has a shot to at least be top 15. Jacksonville is not the easiest matchup for Ashton Jeanty. They're currently allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game. And Ashton Jeanty's offense is not doing him any favors. It is not his fault. It is a lack of blocking at times, as the offensive line just is not nearly as good as what we would have liked it to be, but it's also Geno Smith being ineffective at quarterback, not being able to move the football, and worse off, throwing the interceptions. Way too many interceptions that are killing drives and taking away opportunities for Ashton Jeanty. They added Tyler Lockett, so maybe that helps in the passing game a little bit. But for right now, when you look at Ashton Jeanty, is he a start? Yes, he is. The reason I put him as a fringe start, it's a tougher matchup. I'm worried about picks from Geno Smith. And for Genti, I think he's a little bit closer to being like top 16 to 13 than he would be like being top 12 to top 8. Alvin Kamara has a lot working against him right now, and we don't even know if he's going to be able to play this week. First off, it's a tough matchup. The Rams allow the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Second, Alvin Kamara is hurt. We know he's dealing with an ankle injury, and maybe that is something that has been slowing him down. Maybe it's not entirely new. But third, he hasn't run for more than 31 yards in a game over the last 4 weeks. And on top of it, he hasn't been a top 24 running back. Actually, let me rephrase that. He's been a top 24 running back one time since week 2. And Kamara is way closer to being a sit than a start for me right now. And for those of you out there that own him, maybe you can't afford to sit him. Let me know down in the comments below. If you have Alvin Kamara, do you have better options? And if you don't, are you still willing to risk it with them over him at this point? Kyren Williams feels way more inconsistent this season than what he has in the past. And he's not scoring as many touchdowns as we would like, but this matchup going up against New Orleans that could result in some positive game script would be great for Kyren Williams to have a really solid floor. And if he can find the end zone, probably a pretty decent ceiling this week as well. We know that there's always fireworks when KC and Buffalo end up getting together. And this is a great matchup for the running backs. Buffalo is currently allowing the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. But which running back for the Chiefs? Because if you look at it right now, Isaiah Pacheco and Kareem Hunt are both fringe starts for me. This is a good matchup, but these guys are like back in top 24 because Pacheco to me is a guy that if you're dealing with issues and you need to start somebody, Pacheco can get you 8 carries, 50 yards, something along those lines. Probably not double-digit carries because this is going to be a lot of throwing in this game, but if he can pick up 50 yards on the ground and get you 5-6 fantasy points, that's solid for a flex option if you don't have any other options or if you're just looking for somebody to get you points because that's how you're playing fantasy football right now. For Kareem Hunt, his ceiling is a little bit closer to 10 fantasy points for me because he seems to be the guy getting the work at the goal line and in the red zone. So he has a better opportunity to score. Rashard Smith completely disappeared last week, and he's done that quite a bit this season. So for me, Smith is a guy that I'm just not concerned with even trying to start. James Cook coming off of a huge game, but won't have nearly the advantage in this matchup. Kansas City allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Even though it is a tougher matchup, and even though there's probably going to be a lot of throwing in this game, James Cook finding the end zone once is still a bet that I would be willing to take. Sunday Night Football, Seattle's going to be coming off the bye. Washington's coming off of a tough loss on the road. They're going to look to bounce back, maybe even have Jaden Daniels back this week as well. But for the running backs in Seattle, they both have to be fringe at this point because that's the type of points they're scoring. Is it tough to put them in your lineup? Absolutely. Kenneth Walker still gets a lot of touches. I just talked about it at the beginning of the show. He's still inside the top 24 of touches this season, and that's even with them having the bye last week. Is Kenneth Walker anything more than a low-end RB2 right now? No, he's not, but he's getting enough volume and putting up the numbers to be a low-end RB2 every week. Is Zach Charbonnet anything other than a low-end RB2 right now? No, he's not, because he's not getting the volume that Walker's getting, and he's not nearly as good on the ground as Walker, but he's getting the touchdowns. I'm staying away from the Washington running backs this week. Ja'Cory Crosky-Merritt has been an interesting player to try and start in our lineups every single week. So far, his performances seasons have gone as the RB12, 64, 26, 43, 5, 36, 44, and 50. Wildly inconsistent and way more down weeks than fantasy viable weeks. Jeremy McNichols will be an interesting play in PPR leagues if Marcus Mariota is the starting quarterback again. As of right now, I do believe Jaden Daniels will be ready to go. But Marcus Mariota, if he goes again, he looked at Jeremy McNichols a lot last week. Monday Night Football is going to be Arizona and the Dallas Cowboys. And now everybody on Monday Night Football gets to watch the Cowboys defense in primetime. give up a ton of fantasy points to one of the most inconsistent offenses in football right now. From a running back perspective, Michael Carter was just released by the Arizona Cardinals. Now, it does sound like they're going to try to bring him back. But moving forward, is it Amari DiMercato? Is it Bam Knight? Is DiMercato ready to go this week? He's been banged up. That's something that we'll keep an eye on. We know that this matchup is a good matchup. Dallas is currently allowing the second most fantasy points per game, but we're not going to know more about Amari DiMercato until later in the week because it is a Monday night game. So as of right now, I'm going to list him as questionable, and Bam Knight is a fringe start because if DiMercato doesn't play this week, Bam Knight is probably going to get enough touches to do well against a defense that gives up a ton of yards all over the place. If DiMercato does play, he probably becomes a fringe start for me because he can help a little bit more in the passing game, and Bam Knight would be a sit instead. Javonte Williams continues to be one of the safer running backs in all of football. At the very top of the list when it comes to the most touches, didn't run for a ton of yards last week, but he did have 2 touchdowns. And now he has a rushing touchdown in every single game, but 2 this season. Headliner Nation, there's the first start and sit video out of the way for week 9, and hopefully you're starting to formulate what you want to do with your team this week, and hopefully with Bymageddon being behind us, you're not in nearly as rough shape as you were before. But no Judkins this week, no Breece Hall, no Saquon Barkley, no Rachaad White if you've been utilizing him. Hopefully Bucky Irving can come back next week, but those are still some running backs that you've probably been playing in your fantasy lineups. But hopefully you have enough depth to make it through this week as well. Headliner Nation, stay safe, stay healthy, hit the like button, subscribe, thumbs up, leave a comment, bell notification, all of that good stuff, and I'll see you in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.